Welcome to the teaching ministry of Lakeside Alliance Church. We are a movement of people who are passionate about pursuing Jesus Christ. If you're in Southeast Wisconsin, join us on a Sunday morning and consider partnering in a mission that matters. For now, sit back and open your heart as we hear from God's Word.
When we turn the page from the Old Testament to the New, it's striking to me that the first words we encounter are not a dramatic story filled with suspense and action, nor really do we find, a story of drama or love. What we find is a list of names. The very first words in the New Testament, it's not a great teaching of Jesus, it's not a miracle recorded, it is a genealogy. Genealogies tend to be flyover country. Nobody makes a genealogy a destination. You travel through them to get to the place you want to go. That's how genealogies typically function for the 21st century Christian. Well, my objective today is to excite you about a genealogy. And as I hear those words come out of my mouth, I think of Jesus' words, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. I want to excite you about Jesus' genealogy. If you have a Bible, Matthew 1, it'd be great to have that open. I'm going to read just a little bit of this just to make sure you're oriented to the kind of passage that I'm going to be teaching on this morning. Matthew 1, starting in verse 1, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. And you see how this goes? I'm going to stop there. You see how this goes. Now, what I want to show you from Jesus' genealogy today are three things. How this genealogy points to Jesus as the ultimate hero, the giver of grace, and the source of significance. How this genealogy, this list of names that nobody can pronounce, how this points to Jesus as the ultimate hero, the giver of grace, and the source of significance. Are you ready to get excited? Here we go. First of all, this genealogy points to Jesus as the ultimate hero. Now, there are some real rock stars in this list of names. Everybody had blemishes, okay, we can acknowledge that. Several, in spite of that, would have enjoyed noble standing within the ranks of the people to whom Matthew wrote this gospel. One of the things we have to remember is that when the gospel writers wrote their gospels, they wrote them for people, for Christians, for churches to read in a gathering like this. Several of these names, these faces, would have enjoyed noble standing because so many of the first believers were Jewish. What are some of the names that enjoyed noble standing? Well, start with Abraham, of course. Father Abraham. What did he do that was so great? Well, God came to him and spoke to him. That's a big deal. The living God, Yahweh, came and spoke to Abraham and said, Abraham, guess what? You're moving. Abraham said, where? God said, don't worry about it. I'll tell you later. Just go. So he sets out in faith, not knowing where he was going to be going. He leaves behind everything that's comfortable and familiar and launches out into the unknown. That would have been a big deal. Abraham is a rock star in the Jewish mind. David. Now, we know David's failures, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but his successes are not to be overlooked. I mean, taking out a 9-foot giant is kind of a big deal. And sometimes people forget that Israel's economic and political height took place under David's leadership. The pinnacle, the climax of Israel's history took place under David's leadership. He's a big deal, regarded with great nobility by the Jewish people. Hezekiah. Here's another one. He put the high places out of business. Hezekiah was an idol terminator. He was an idol terminator. Put the high places out of business. In fact, it's interesting. In Israel's long list of kings, and you can just thumb through Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and the Chronicles. You can thumb through that and see there's king after king after king after king. Lots of them. Only 2 kings does the text say the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. Those words, the Lord was with him. Only 2 kings. Who are they? David and Hezekiah. How about Josiah? Josiah is another one. The text says that Josiah did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He brought Israel back to a scripture-centered way of life. He renewed the covenant. Josiah is viewed by the Jewish people as a great reformer. He was a great reformer. He inherited a mess and he cleaned it up. And so you've got heroes, you've got people in the genealogy that would have enjoyed noble standing within the first century Jewish context that Matthew writes this. By doing this, by evoking the great heroes of the past, Matthew points us to the ultimate hero that all these stories anticipate. It's Matthew's way of illustrating what Jesus says in Luke 24 and John 5. Well, what does Jesus say about himself there? Well, let me take you to one of those passages. In Luke 24, look at these words. Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe." Now watch this. "All that the prophets have spoken." Okay, now we're in the Old Testament. Prophets. "Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures." Whenever you see the word scriptures in the New Testament, it's a reference to the Old Testament scriptures. "He explained to his disciples what was said about him," Jesus, "in the Old Testament." It's all about him. Jesus is saying, look, they wrote about me. They wrote about me. Augustine, writing many years ago, said the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. Matthew's genealogy is literally showing us Jesus is the goal the Old Testament anticipates and points to. So the Old Testament, folks, was not a game of chess between God and the bad guys until God had had enough, and then he plays the trump card and he sends Jesus. That's not it. Israel's history, all of it, is there on purpose. All of it, every detail, every story, every character, all of it is there on purpose to point to anticipate, to foreshadow Jesus as the ultimate hero. Let me give you a very, very quick way in which it does that. Very quick. Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve faced a test in the garden. Did they not? Serpent come along. Did God really say? Right? You've got this exchange that goes back and forth. They were being tested, were they not? How did they do? Not well. Not well. Who else faced the test in a garden? Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane. What was the test? You remember what was going on there? Remember, he's sweating as though it's drops of blood. What kind of stress is he under? And at that moment he prays, "If it be possible, Father, let this cup pass from me." Is he being tested? Oh, he's being tested. But how do you finish that prayer? "Yet not my will, but yours be done." How did Jesus do with his test in the garden? He passed superbly. Adam and Eve's failure in the garden is an anticipation of Jesus' success in the garden. How about Noah? Everybody knows the story of Noah. You know why Noah got to board the boat? In the book of Genesis, you know why he got to board the boat? Because God found Noah righteous. In fact, Noah's family was the beneficiary of his righteousness. Does that sound familiar at all? Metaphorically speaking, another flood is coming. Jesus points to Noah's flood to give us a heads up that another flood is coming in the form of God's final and climactic judgment. It looms on the horizon. It's coming. Only those part of Jesus' family get to board the boat. Jesus' family will be saved because of his righteousness. He's the ultimate hero. The story of Noah is anticipating and pointing forward to that. How about Joseph? Let's go Joseph. Joseph was betrayed by his own family. taken captive in Egypt. Any of that sound familiar to you? Years later, he finds himself second in command of that empire when his brothers, his betrayers come walking through the door. How does he use his power? Here are the people who betrayed me. They turned me over to my enemies. Now I'm second in command. I have great power. How shall I wield that power? Well, how does Joseph wield that power? Well, instead of using his power to retaliate against his betrayers, he uses it to preserve their lives. Does that sound familiar? Jesus was given up by his own people. He came unto his own people that they did not receive him. He's betrayed. He's handed over to his enemies. Where is he now? At the right hand of God the Father. And how is he wielding his power? To get back at his betrayers? That's you and me? To get back at us? No. He uses his power to save us. He's the ultimate hero. Let's take David. David and Goliath. Everybody loves to prop up that story as you go face your giants with great faith and you'll win. I've lived long enough to know you get beat sometimes. I'm not sure that's what that's about. It's not what it's about. What's it about? It's very interesting. You've got two armies staring at each other from across the valley. Why didn't they go at it? Send the thousands of men, go have them fight each other. Instead, what happens? One army sends out Goliath, another army sends out David. And we'll let them fight, and whatever happens to them will happen to us. Ancient world is called representational fighting. Representational fighting. Whatever happens to the one happens to the rest of us. What happens? We know how the story goes. David wins, and how is Israel treated? As if they won. As if they won. Did they lift a finger to accomplish it themselves? No. David did it for them. It was representational fighting, and David's victory was imputed to Israel. Does that sound familiar? Jesus in his death and his resurrection wins. He wins. And his victory over sin and death is imputed. It's given to his people, us. We could go on and on and on. We could look at every one of those Old Testament stories and see how in some way it's anticipating, it's pointing towards Jesus. The Old Testament, folks, was not an elaborate game of chess between God and the bad guys. So God had enough. They said, okay, forget about it. We're not going to do this anymore. Here's Jesus. Ball game over. No. All of Israel's history is there on purpose. To point to anticipate, to foreshadow Jesus as the ultimate hero. It's the first aspect to the genealogy of Jesus. Are you excited yet? Second, the genealogy of Jesus points to him as the giver of grace. As the giver of grace. In the ancient world, genealogies functioned something like a resume. It was a vehicle for evoking praise of the person through the listing off of the family line. That's your pedigree. Yeah, your heritage. This is why this person should be revered. Look at all the people that were part of this line, right? So if Jesus' genealogy is a kind of resume, what do we learn about him through what's mentioned in it? What kind of genealogical line would you expect the King of the universe to come from? Jesus is talked about as the Messiah. We saw that in verse 1. Messiah had kingship kind of overtones to it. Okay, so this genealogy is in some way, this is announcing a king. Well, what kind of genealogical line would we expect the King of the universe to come from? Well, the list is quite a collection. There's some good folks mentioned here. We've mentioned a few of those, but there's some really troubled people mentioned in this genealogical line. Take Jacob. Jacob, don't let anybody fool you about Jacob. Jacob was a conniving twit. He was a conniving twit who tricked his brother Esau into giving him their father's blessing. He had a long line of deception. David, yeah, we know his successes, but you know what? We got adultery in there. We got murder in there. Solomon, extraordinarily wise. And yet, somehow his wisdom didn't serve to curb his polygamous lifestyle. Rehoboam was more interested in the input of his college frat buddies than the elders, which led to a disaster for the nation. Ahaz, king of Judah, participated in child sacrifice. something God had strictly forbidden, and not just sacrificing any child, his own son. In the genealogical run-up to Joseph and Mary, there are 4 women mentioned. Why just 4? There are other women. Why these 4? The women aren't Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Why those 4? 3 of them have sordid pasts. Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute to trick Judah into impregnating her. Rahab was a prostitute. Bathsheba got caught up in an adulterous affair. Ruth was a godly woman, very godly woman, but as a Moabitess, she had her origins. The whole people group had their origins in incest. The Jewish people did not look upon the Moabites as a people of great worth or value. So if the genealogy is a kind of resume, this isn't the most flattering list to be a part of. You sure you want this trotted out in public to announce your pedigree? As an illustration of this, the Jewish king Herod, who's part of the Christmas story, the Jewish king Herod deleted names from his genealogy. Some of his ancestors were Edomites, and for someone who aspired to be a Jewish king, that would not have played well with the Jewish public. So he got rid of them. I don't know how you do that, but he just got rid of them. He didn't want to be associated with them. He knew that this was going to come to his harm for what his aspirations were. The biblical writers leave in Jesus' genealogy names that Herod would have expunged. How many take pride in being the descendants of deceivers, prostitutes, adulterers, and murderers? These are the type of people in Jesus' biological ancestry. Let me tell you something. It is really good news. It's really good news. Modern people sometimes have a view of Jesus that says, Jesus is for the moral people. Jesus is for the people who have it together. He would not be interested in somebody like me because I have a past. Well, the very first words in the New Testament convey a vastly different message. Jesus clearly is not ashamed to be associated with messy people. He, in some way, shape, or form, identifies with them. Later in Jesus' ministry, we get a very clear picture of this when he explicitly says he came not for the healthy, but for the sick. So if you have a past, or you know someone who has a past, or you think about people in our community who have a past, Jesus came precisely for people like this. Just 4 verses after Matthew finishes the genealogy, he introduces Jesus as the one who will save his people from their sins. So he came into our world with the express purpose of saving people like the ones in his own genealogical line. He's not ashamed to be associated with sinners. He came to associate with sinners. He came to love them. He came to die for them. He came to save them. He came to change them. George Whitefield was a 1700s preacher. He had a brother who had drifted into a very messy and sinful lifestyle. I don't know what the circumstances were surrounding this, but somehow he came out to hear his brother preach one day. And as he listened to his brother preach, his conscience was pricked, and he began to be in distress. He was crying out verbally to those around them, I'm a lost man, I'm a lost man, I'm a lost man. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink. A little later, he was at a gathering. There was a woman there by the name of Lady Huntington, and Whitefield recounted to her what had transpired as he listened to his brother preach. She asked him to repeat the thing that he kept repeating to himself and out loud. He said to her, I'm a lost man. And she responded, and she said, I'm glad for it. I'm glad for it. Well, he was baffled by that. So he asked her, how can you say that? And she explained, I'm glad you're lost because it is written, the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. She was glad to hear Mr. Whitefield say this because she knew only those who know they're lost are the recipients of Jesus' salvation. Jesus so identifies with our sickness and our lostness. He came into the world through the line of sick and lost people in order to heal them and find them. And so, even in this list of names, there's an implicit invitation. There's an implicit invitation. Don't try to clean up your act and then approach Jesus. Come to Jesus as you are. Come with your mess. Come with your sickness. You're not the one who can fix that. You come to him and you let Jesus be your physician. You let Jesus be your Savior. And in that, you will discover how Jesus is the giver of grace. Third, the genealogy points to Jesus as the source of significance. Now, if you've had any familiarity with the Bible, you know that genealogies are common. They're common. The book of Genesis contains numerous genealogies. In the NIV, you'll read something like, this is the account of so-and-so's family line. In the ESV, it'll say generations of so-and-so. And then it'll list the descendants of that individual. Those genealogies didn't list the name of the individual and then their ancestors. And it's for this reason that Jesus' genealogy is a bit unique, because it's backwards. You might say, well, it didn't have to be. Jesus didn't have descendants per se. So who else were they going to list? I'll grant you that. But then why have a genealogy at all? Particularly when genealogies came with kind of freight that we've discussed already. It was a kind of resume. Your name is highlighted, and then you got all these people that you're a part of, and it's a way of saying to everybody out there, this is why this person's worthy of repute. I get my significance from them, right? Pedigrees were important. This is why I have to be, or this person should be associated with this list of people, because this person gets their significance from the pedigree that they're a part of. But Jesus' genealogy actually puts this in reverse. You know what Jesus says to us effectively through his genealogy? Jesus says, in effect, you are in the family line of me. He says, you get your significance from me. This genealogy in Matthew 1 is not Jesus' resume. It's Abraham's resume. It's Isaac's resume. It's David's resume. It's Bathsheba's resume. It's Tamar's resume. It's all those mentioned. And if you are in Christ, it is your resume. The traditional genealogy says, I get my significance from them. Jesus says, you get your significance from me. I want to park here for a moment and put this on Main Street. Our significance is always tied to something. We tie our significance to something. We tie our significance to our careers. We shoot for careers that carry notoriety, perhaps, and we seek to be A-plus players in our field. Or we tie our significance to our beauty. If I look like this, or if I wear that, I'll feel desirable. We tie our significance to some expertise we believe we possess. If I display my mastery over this topic or this field of study, then I will feel valuable. We tie our significance to moral and religious performance. And we think that if we serve and we attend all these studies, then we will feel reputable. In all these cases, the tying of our significance is going in the wrong direction. Let me illustrate this. Terry Wardle tells an amusing story from his childhood. He had a hand-me-down, fixed-up, big blue girls' Schwinn bike. And one day, his mom finally let him venture outside his own neighborhood, and he describes what happened next. I had broken free of all the constraints of my little neighborhood, and now I was on my own to experience a grand adventure. I felt like a somebody, even on a big blue girls' Schwinn bike with saddlebags. I crossed the railroad tracks, then rumbled over a small creek on a single-lane bridge. The bridge, made of wood and steel, was no big deal, but on that day long ago, it became a bridge too far. As I began to cross, 4 teenage boys stepped out onto the far side of the bridge. I intended to pass on by. They had other things in mind. One of the boys grabbed my handlebars and spun my bike to an abrupt stop. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" he snarled. Another boy chimed in, "Yeah, kid, where are you going?" Instantly, I knew they intended to beat me up. I was petrified. I couldn't fight or break free to run, so I stood frozen. Suddenly, one of the bullies asked, "What's your name?" I answered him in a high-pitched, pre-adolescent, quivering voice, "Terry Wardle." The three remaining teenagers got a bit silent and looked at one another nervously. "Are you related to Tom Wardle?" Tom was a much older cousin who happened to play defensive end on the high school football team. But I lied, and I told them Tom was my older brother. They immediately backed off. One of the boys straightened out my shirt, started saying, "Hey, we're just funning you, no harm. You're a great kid. If anybody ever gives you any kind of trouble, you let us know. We'll take care of you." Terry writes, "That was a formative day for me. I learned that simply being Terry Wardle was not enough to be respected, accepted, and safe." That's the crux of the issue. Whether it's career, beauty, expertise, moral performance, it's not enough. It's not enough to be respected, accepted, and safe. You know why? Because at some point your career is going to come to an end, your beauty is going to fade, your mind will no longer work the way it once did, sin's going to trip you up, you're going to find yourself enslaved to those you're trying to impress. So if your significance is tied to something that can change, if it's tied to something that can be lost or stolen or taken away, you're setting yourself up for enormous disappointment. Being you and all that you are is not enough. You need to be identified with, connected to somebody else. In Jesus' genealogy, he is saying to us, Brian, John, Sarah, Tracy, you can't tie your significance to some created thing. You need to tie your significance to me. Well, how do we do that? How do we tie our significance to Jesus? Well, what did Tom need to do? What did Terry need to do in order to find his significance in his own story? He had to identify himself. He had to be connected to. He had to be in the family of somebody else. What is a genealogy? It's a family. It's a family. It's a family. When we realize we've been brought into Jesus' family, and that your significance is no longer being Terry Wardle, it's being associated with Tom Wardle. You're no longer you, you're associated with Jesus. You'll have all you need. You'll have all you need. Your status is fixed. Knowing that has a way of detaching from us other sources of significance. And it's not just that we're now in Jesus' family and we can say to anybody who asks, I belong to Jesus. It's also considering what Jesus did in order to make that happen. This is not by accident. This was not by some fluke of history. It was very purposeful. What did Jesus do so that you could be able to say to anybody who asks, I am part of the family line of Jesus? What did he do? Matt Woodley helps us understand that. He writes, 18 years ago, my friend Andy and his wife traveled to a South American country to complete their adoption of a little girl. At the time, this country was gripped by corruption, violence, and political chaos. After Andy arrived, they kept upping the price for the adoption. When he finally threatened to take the matter to the U.S. consulate, a mysterious figure confronted Andy, warning him of vague but dreadful consequences. It was like a spy thriller, except it was Andy, who was caught in the middle of some sinister and dangerous plot. But he refused to leave without his daughter. The odd thing was that Andy had never met this girl. She was small and helpless. She hadn't won any awards. She hadn't aced any tests. She was just an orphan, condemned to die a life of grinding poverty in a far-flung developing country. Matt continues. He says, for some crazy reason, Andy stayed there, negotiating with corrupt officials, spending oodles of money, squandering time, and even risking his life to find and win this little girl. Now, 18 years later, Andy was telling me about an intimate high school graduation party for Maria, his adopted daughter. At one point during the meal, Maria unexpectedly stood up and gave a beautiful speech, thanking everyone who had helped her find a better life. And it all started when Andy walked into that dangerous nightmare in an attempt to bring her home. When he finished telling me the story, writes Matt, it struck me that Andy, my non-Christian friend, had discovered the heart of the gospel, God's loving, daring, persistent pursuit of people like you and me. And like Maria, there's nothing we can do to earn God's love, but he still loves us. And he doesn't want to leave us behind. Instead, in the person of Jesus, God walked into the dangerous nightmare of human sin in order to save us and adopt us into his family. I want you to think about that. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is the adoption process. We were orphans, condemned to live a life of grinding poverty, and far worse. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is the mission and the mess that he entered to make you part of his genealogical line. It's the mission and mess he entered to adopt you as his son or daughter. You are not enough on your own. You're not enough on your own. You're not enough. You need to be able to say, don't look at me. My value is in the fact that I belong to the family line of Jesus Christ. And here's what he's done for me. His life, death, and resurrection is the adoption process. It's the mission and the mess he entered to make you his son or daughter. Because if you have that, you have everything.